Going to go over 300 million years in 15 minutes. So we'll be going at about 20 million years a minute here on various things. But we're going to basically go from little critters like it looks like there up on the upper left, all the way through these various things to end up with human beings. And we'll start off with what did the world look like 300 million years ago? So this is what we think, artist rendition of what we think was happening. The continents are basically all colliding at this point. You're basically getting lots of very shallow seas, lots of coastline. Land has been invaded by plants and insects quite a bit before that. Now you're starting to get your tetrapods, especially your amphibians that are all living in here, coming along in there, and other critters as well are starting to move into land. Jump ahead 20 million years, and this is what's happening. You're losing your shallow seas. You're losing some of your coastline. What you're gaining is lots and lots of interior land. So that becomes both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge, of course, is water balance. All right, life basically started in the ocean. Water balance has got different ideas there. Once you get on land, you basically start leaking water all over the place and start having difficulties. So the idea of animals here, all of that interior land is potential open habitat for things if they can solve the water balance problem. So there's a whole set of very, very ancient adaptations that are all around water balance. One of the first ones is the amniotic egg. So that's the egg that has these extra three membranes, the chorion, the amnion, and the allantois, which of course you'll realize at some point become the three membranes of the mammalian placenta, eventually about several 100 million years later. It's an advantage for laying eggs on land. You basically have it occurring in here. And then you have two basic lineages of amniots. You have the sauropsids, which are all of the reptiles, and that makes birds warm-blooded reptiles with feathers. And you have the synapsids, of which the only surviving lineage are the three lineages of mammals. So from about 300 to 251 million years ago, synapsids were the dominant terrestrial vertebrates. They were the apex predators. Some renditions here. This is a fossilized skeleton of a Dimetrodon that's in the Natural History Museum. You can see this big, giant, nasty apex predator in there. But then along came the Permian-Triassic extinction event. Basically slapped the synapsids down quite a bit, and people usually refer to what happened afterwards as the age of the dinosaurs, though it should be more technically correct to say it's the age of the sauropsids that took off from that period there. But we know a synapsid lineage did get through, at least one, because we're here and all the mammals are here. And basically, if we jump ahead to 195 million years ago, all those dominant terrestrial apex predators have now become basically what we know is tiny little insectivorous animals. So that's what we think it looked like. That's what we actually have is the little skull. That's the size it was right here. But we're pretty much sure that it lactated. Now we're never going to know what proportion of synapses lactated. All right, at least one lineage of synapses lactated. I suspect very highly unlikely that all of them did. I don't think Dimetrodon lactated, but the only ones that got through that extinction event and managed to make it to now were the lactating lineage. All right, and that just implies to me how important and how advantageous lactation was as an adaptive advantage. So this is what I think of as milk. Right? I don't think of milk as a food. I don't even think of it as the total diet of an infant. I think it is a means by which mammalian mothers biochemically signal to their offspring in order to guide their growth and development. It's an ancient adaptation. It's the original one. Of course, placentas now come in and do a huge amount of that job for us. But milk was the first one. Lactation was the first to do that. It allows for an extended period of time of maternal signaling. And it offers the possibility of modification of signaling. So a bird puts a huge amount of biochemical information into an egg to guide the growth and development of that embryo until it becomes a hatchling. But once they've put it in there, it cannot be modified. It cannot be added to. It's just there. Mammals have this long extended period of time in which you can have different signaling going on, and in different birth events, you can have different signaling from the same mother to different offspring. So I think of this as, I assume all of you know very much about the development origins of health and disease. It's a big thing these days talking about how early life experience really changes your risks for both health and pathology later on in life. To me, though, this is a mammalian adaptive advantage. This is one of the reasons why mammals were actually successful. It's because we have this ability to actually modify, to a certain extent, development early on in life to actually come up with different potential outcomes. And finally, I'm going to say that everything in milk is a biochemical signal, and that even includes the macronutrients. So you think of the nutrients, yeah, it's nutritional, but it's actually a biochemical signal. And what I'm going to basically, in this very short talk to you about is protein and growth and how I look at it. So here we're gone about another 80, 90 million years closer to the future, to the present. Right here, you can see there in the middle, that's the common ancestor of all the placental mammals, right? Which also means that is a single milk. That's an ancestral milk that's right there, that all of the other milks that we can see today came from. Now, one of my research interests is to try to figure out sort of what that milk probably looked like. We'll never know. Milk doesn't fossilize, so we'll never be able to tell for sure, but we can get a sort of idea. And in fact, my idea at the moment, it's probably was a high protein milk, which is basically what you get in all of the xenarthrin milks. So all the xenarthrin milks are high protein. Good chance, based on a lot of characteristics, this is probably a very high protein milk. But then we also have this huge diversity of placental mammals. And that huge diversity of mammals leads to a huge diversity of milks and milk composition on this. And the other thing that I'm looking at in my research is what are the adaptive and selective pressures and constraints that lead to different types of milk and end up producing this wide variety of milks that we have. All right, so what influences milk macronutrient composition? Phylogeny is always going to matter. All right, the simplest one we have here is all xenarthrins, even though I have insectivores, omnivores, and herbivores, they all have high protein milks. They all have a similarity in there. So phylogeny is always going to make an important aspect to it, both in terms of constraining milk and also potentially constraining what an animal can do. But then we have, here's a short list of some of the other things I've looked at. I have a litter versus a singleton. Nursing interval, is a nursing interval short or long? All of these things depend on the nutritional density of the milk. But you'll notice I say allows dilute milk often here. I don't know of any animal that produces a litter that also produces a dilute milk. They all produce nutritionally dense milk. But I do know animals that produce a singleton that produces a nutritionally dense milk. So these things all sort of work together. This is on one side for the infant. Here we have maternal constraints. There's a whole set of dietary metabolic constraints on the mother because we're always talking about a potential conflict here. What's good for the infant is actually a cost often for the mother. And so you have to balance those things and come up with a thing there. But what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk is neonatal growth rate. We have animals that grow fast. We have animals that grow slow. And I'm going to look at it in terms of the protein content of milk. And I'm going to tell you the best way to look at it is to express the protein content on an energy basis. So I'm getting a little bit geeky here and sit there and grumble a little bit how people express milk in publications and everything. And in human studies, it's mostly the same as I've seen. It's grams per 100 mil. And I understand that because that's how they measure it in the lab. Most of these assays are probably done on a volume basis. They've set their pipetter for a certain particular volume. They're taking a certain volume of the various milks and looking at it. And most of the results usually end up coming out on a weight basis, so grams. Now, for human milk, grams per 100 mil is probably pretty close to what grams per 100 gram or percent would be, because the density of human milk is about the same as water. But I study all of the different placental mammal milks. So I do all of my assays on a weight basis, because I guarantee you a mil of seal milk does not weigh the same as a mil of rhino milk. That high-fat milk is going to weigh less than water in there. So I end up expressing my measurements as percent, but that's how I measure it. That's the lab reality. It's certainly a reality, but it's the lab reality. In the research, I'm trying to understand the effect on mother and the effect on the infant, the neonate. And there I claim that energy, expressing it on an energy basis, is actually a much more better biological way to actually look at the nutrients in milk. So I express it either as the percentage of gross energy or as milligrams of whatever nutrient I'm looking at per kilocalorie. So not per gram, not per mil, per kilocalorie of milk to look across here. We'll start off looking at what's called the geometric framework. The geometric framework is used quite a bit in nutritional ecology it also works brilliantly, in my opinion, for milk. Okay. So here at the top, you have the equation for gross energy content of milk. That's the total amount of milk energy. It's what you would get if you ran it through a bomb calorimeter and got the total amount of energy released by combustion. That's the formula for it. Any of you who are used to the Atwater things for metabolic energy, you think, wait a minute, that should be 494. The reason why we're using 5.86 and not 4 is that putting 4 in here would be what you and I would get out of drinking milk, an adult. But neonates are growing. So most of the protein for most species is actually being deposited on the body. Furthermore, this is much more likely what the cost to the mother is in there. So most of these amino acids are probably not being turned into glucose for most species in the neonate. So here I have percentage of carbohydrate, percentage of gross energy from carbohydrate on the horizontal axis, percentage of gross energy from fat here, and my 45-degree lines end up being the percentage of energy from protein. So if I drew a line from 100 to 100, that means there's no protein whatsoever. If I went down to the origin, that's 100% protein. This is where whole milk you'd buy at the store, at least in the United States. I don't know if it's different in Canada or not. But regulated, this is basically where you'd get. But if you think of this as a bead on a string, if I move this up this way, oops, sorry, let's go back. If I move this up, you would get more and more energy from fat, less from sugar. Move it down, more and more energy from sugar, less from fat. But I never change the amount of energy I'm getting from protein. Okay. In general, milks you see range from about maybe 50% from protein to maybe somewhere in 90% of protein. So there's a band in here where you're going to find these. So here's my first example. Asian elephants versus white rhinos. Very different looking milks, incredibly looking different if you simply looked at the percentages you measured on a lab. Furthermore, in Asian elephants, you have a dramatic change over time with increasing fat, increasing protein, and increasing sugar. But if you look at it, yes, the percentage of energy from sugar declines, percentage of energy from fat increases, but it just goes straight up along this line with no change whatsoever in the energy coming from protein. Even though this milk has about 4% protein and this milk out here could have anywhere from 8 to 10%. But on an energy basis, it's equivalent. Now I run down to a rhino milk. Okay, elephants are pretty much running on fat. Rhinos are running on sugar. Very, very low density milks, very high sugar. But as a protein source, exactly equivalent to this. So as long as the calf gets the same amount, so if they get the same amount of calories, they're going to get the same amount of protein. Now, there's lots of other differences, and I would never feed a rhino calf elephant milk and an elephant calf rhino milk. But as a protein source, this shows that these are actually the same, which then makes sense when you realize that these animals, these calves, basically grow at about the same rate. They grow almost at about close to a kilogram a day in terms of both species. The other example I had from the very beginning of my looking at milk was the common marmoset, one of my favorite species, but I've done an awful lot of work on in all sorts of different aspects. Here I have milk from both captive and wild animals. So I have both from animals in the wild and animals in a captive setting. You'll notice that this is the gross energy content of milk, so the kilocalories per gram. You have almost a twofold difference between the low energy milks to the high energy milks. The low energy milks have a lot of sugar per kilocalorie and relatively little fat. The high energy milks have about the same amount of sugar and fat per kilocalorie. Protein does not change. Protein goes right across there. There's no difference. So it doesn't matter whose mom these infants have. As long as the mom can produce enough energy in milk, it will produce exactly the same amount of protein for that animal. And this is the amount it gets, about 35.5 milligrams of protein per kilocalorie, or 20.8%. If I zip back here, you'll notice these guys had about 17% of energy from protein and about 30 milligrams for there. It's very difficult to compare the growth rates of a tiny little animal like this to an elephant. But in relative proportions, we think of these animals as being faster growing, and this would be consistent with that. A higher level of energy from protein would relate to a higher relative growth rate. So I'm now going to jump to our lineage all the way to the present. And we're essentially one of the great apes at this point, a specific branch off the great apes. So we're looking here at the gorillas, your chimps and bonobos, my orangs. If you look at the sugar content as measured in the lab, pretty much the same. It's a primate milk. Almost all primates have, all anthropoid primates basically have about 7% or so sugar in their milk. They're basically a relatively high water, lower nutrient density milk. Protein all looks roughly the same. Gorillas seem to be sitting up there a little bit, though a human population comes close. Orangs are sitting at the bottom. Okay. The big difference is in fat. Human milk has about twice as much fat as the other species, so that would be the big difference. But what I want you to look at, of course, is the protein as a percent of energy or the milligrams for there. Gorillas are the fastest growing of all these species. They have the highest amount of protein on energy basis. Orangs are the slowest growing. They've not only dropped their protein content and kept everything else pretty much the same, that results in a very low, one of the lowest percentages of protein energy basis. Interestingly enough, now if you look at humans, human values for protein looks pretty much like a chimp or a bonobo, and actually looks greater than that of an orangutan. But if you look at it on the energy basis, we're sitting down there with the orangs. So why are we considered a slow growing species? Well, mainly it's because where is the most growth happening in the first year to 2 years of life? It's here. It's the brain. The brain is what's growing. The brain is very energy intensive. Growing brain is energy intensive. It's not protein intensive. We're not growing muscle and other tissues like that. We're growing brain. So what's happened is protein stayed the same in the milk. Energy content went up because we increased this. Okay, so you can make an argument. This has helped feeding that brain growth in there. But that actually reduces in there, says, yep, we are actually fairly different from, well, we're like an orangutan, but we're different from a chimp bonobo. If I look at all this stuff is come from E.A. Quinn's paper, Milk at Altitude. These are her summary studies where she had her pick. This is the data at altitude up there. In the paper, they made a big deal about the fact that this looks higher. This is about the same. Protein's a little bit higher, but big difference talking about it. But when you look over here, it's just human milk. There really isn't any change at that altitude there. In fact, my bet here is this has to do with the water content of blood. That at altitude, you actually have a higher dry matter content in blood. And since milk and blood tends to be isotonically equivalent, I suspect what here is just a simple difference in water content we're talking about here. But expressing it on an energy basis tells me, yep, I'm looking at basically the same type of protein. Now, finally, let's look at a potential infant formula. If you're going to formula feed your baby, this is just one example. It was taken from powder, where I basically made an estimate to saying when you mix the powder up, you're going to get about 80% water. So I made a thing there. Fat's pretty good. Sugar's pretty good. Protein's a little on the high side. But when you look at the protein on an energy basis, this looks like an excellent formula for a chimp or a bonobo. But it's actually somewhat over supplementing a human baby. Now, as I understand it, all of our infant growth curves now are based on breastfed babies. And one of the reasons they do that is formula-fed babies have been usually known to grow faster. And to me, this is one of the reasons why formula-fed babies will grow faster. You're simply over-supplementing them. You have a higher level of protein on an energy basis coming in there. And fast growth is not necessarily good. First of all, there's a huge number of things that I'd rather have a baby get that are in human breast milk. Lots and lots of interesting biochemical. There's huge amounts of advantage to getting this. But growing faster actually increases the risk of later on obesity and several of the metabolic diseases. So this is another reason why I think that there's a little bit of the infant formula showing a little bit of risk in there. So that's the quick thing running through to say, and I will say this for anything you look at in milk, think about looking at it on an energy basis, right? Don't just think about looking at it as a percentage or as a concentration and everything. Think about how it fits in with the energy. because we know that the infant's going to take in a certain amount of energy, and that's going to tell you what's going on in there. And energy in milks, even in human milks, will vary. I'm going to finish up with just a fun little play thing. I'm going to pick a peptide in milk, amylase. Why the hell should there be amylase in milk? There's absolutely no reason whatsoever there should be amylase in milk. Amylase is a starch digester. There is no starch in milk. You do know if a woman is breastfeeding, a pediatrician, and she wants to switch her baby over to rice cereal, the pediatrician could probably suggest to her that she do that in conjunction with a nursing event, or even to mix some of her own breast milk with the cereal, because that will help the baby digest it. If you put breast milk into rice cereal, it will turn into absolute liquid because it will digest all that starch and turn it into glucose right away. It's produced by salivary glands and pancreas, but in the humans, we have it expressed in the mammary gland. Just totally weird. Also in humans, there's a huge gene duplication occurred about 300,000 years ago. So all of us have multiple copies of the salivary amylase gene of different levels. The more copies you have, the more salivary amylase in your mouth and in milk that you will produce. So I thought, oh, cool, this is going to be fun. I have a nice little paper. I'll show this is a unique human event, right? Nope. Ran salivary amylase activity in milks of all different ones. Yes, for almost all of my non-human primates, I get nothing. This is just noise. And there's the chimps. There's the chimp sitting there. If you think of this as 2 copies of the gene, this would come out to be about 10 to 12 copies of the gene, which is about right for what I would expect on average on there. So this implies that the mutational event that allowed salivary amylase gene to be expressed in mammary gland occurred here, sometime after the split between gorillas. But what the hell happened with bonobos? There's a question of what's going on with that, which is a confusion in the literature right now. But for me, the thing about amylase in there, what are the evolutionary implications for us on this? And one of the things is, at what point in our evolutionary history did we start giving our infants starchy foods, either starchy weaning foods or very early on? And did this lead to the fact that interbirth intervals in humans is a lot shorter than interbirth intervals in the apes, which increases fertility, which increases the number of babies that can produce and possibly the number of babies that survive past weaning, and therefore allowed us to eventually populate the world? And I'll leave you with that and take questions.